Good evening and welcome everyone to the third biennial Brad Sheafor Lecture and Social Work featuring Dr. Michael Yellowbird. My name is David McPhee and I serve as the interim director for the School of Social Work at Colorado State University. I'm pleased to begin our event this evening with CSU's land acknowledgement and a personal lead into it. I grew up in Shoshone County, Idaho, adjacent to Kootenai, Latah, Benawa, and Nez Perce counties, all with indigenous names, all of their peoples invisible to and marginalized by contemporary people of European descent. I did not realize how much my forebears took from the original inhabitants until later in adulthood when I started reading books such as Chief Joseph and In the Spirit of Crazy Horse, and doing collaborative work with the Ute Mountain Ute and Northern Navajo tribes. In recognition of all that my people have taken from the First Nations and all that remains to be healed, I would like to have you reflect on the following land acknowledgement. Colorado State University acknowledges with respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. CSU is founded as a land-grant institution, and we accept that our mission must encompass access to education and inclusion, and significantly that our founding came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this university was built upon. This acknowledgement is the education and inclusion we must practice in recognizing our institutional history, responsibility, and commitment. Please observe a brief moment of silence in respect of this history. I would like to briefly acknowledge the service of Brad Sheafor. During a 38-year career at CSU, Dr. Sheafor made significant contributions as a key teacher and administrator, a leader in national and professional groups, and an author of key textbooks used in the School of Social Work at CSU and throughout the world. Dr. Sheafor's national leadership and contributions to the field of social work are carried on through the Brad Sheafor Lecture Series in social work. I'd also like to acknowledge donors to the fund who helped carry on Brad's legacy, and CSU's Department of Ethnic Studies and the CSU Native American Cultural Center for partnering with the School of Social Work on this event. If you have questions for Dr. Yellowbird today, please post them using the Q&A function on your screen. I will be monitoring the Q&A and selecting questions to ask Dr. Yellowbird at the end of the program. Now it's my pleasure to present Ron Hall, who will introduce Dr. Yellowbird.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Brad Sheafor Lecture in Social Work. This lecture series brings recognized experts like Dr. Yellowbird to the CSU community to better inform faculty, students, social work practitioners, and the community on cutting-edge topics of current interest in social work and human services. My name is Ron Hall. I'm on the faculty of the Ethnic Studies Department, a lawyer, consultant, and researcher working on a range of tribal issues. Most significantly, I'm Dr. Michael Yellowbird's brother. Today is a special day. Dr. Yellowbird and I are from the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. Our mothers are sisters, and we have a very close, large, and wonderful family. We were raised in a large extended family, and we heard many pieces of knowledge and wisdom embedded in stories that humored and scared us at the same time. Dr. Yellowbird has bravely sought to further and share this knowledge through his academic career. He connects a broad range of disciplines to find answers to age-old questions, some found in ancient ways, some embedded in cutting-edge technology and science. Perhaps what I admire most is that my brother walks his talk and is strong in his personal practice. Michael Yellowbird, MSW, PhD, is Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He's an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation in North Dakota. His research focuses on the effects of colonization and methods of decolonization, ancestral health, indigenous mindfulness, neurodecolonization, and the cultural significance of res dogs. Dr. Yellowbird is the founder of the Center for Mindful Decolonization and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba and serves as a consultant and advisor to mindfulness organizations seeking to use mindfulness practices to address systemic racism. He's also the author of numerous scholarly articles, book chapters, research reports, and co-edited books. He's the co-author of two recent books, Asanish Arikara Ethnobotany and Decolonizing Holistic Pathways for Integrative Healing in Social Work. On behalf of the School of Social Work in CSU's College of Health and Human Sciences, welcome my brother, Dr. Michael Yellowbird.
Thank you. I would really say thank you to my brother, Ron. That's a really great introduction. I really am humbled by your words, your younger brother there. And like you said, we come from the same people and, you know, almost the two sisters. So it's really, I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Ron, for that introduction. And thank you. I want to just begin by giving my thanks to Colorado State for the introduction or the invitation to speak at Brad Sheafor Lecture Series. I just wanted to mention very quickly, I did meet Brad some years ago when I was first starting my career in social work as a faculty member. And I recall Brad being a very helpful, very nice, and a very top scholar at the time. And I visit Colorado State in Fort Collins. I also want to give a special shout out to all my relatives. I know a number of my relatives are participating on this tonight. And when I say relatives, I'm talking about my people back home, but I'm talking about all these indigenous people across Turtle Island, all these folks over in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia, all around the world. A number of people that I've met. I know that we're going to be here in different places that I've been at, universities. I've had students who mentioned they were going to be on the call tonight, and also colleagues from different places. So thank you for being here and for supporting this lecture series. Also, I want to thank each and every one of you for the good work that you're doing. I know many of you are doing a lot of really good work in decolonization. And with that, I just want to go and finally end with saying thank you to all the knowledge holders and all the keepers of culture among our indigenous people who have managed to keep these ideas alive. So I want to just go ahead and begin and jump into my presentation here entitled Neurodecolonization and the Medicine Wheel, an Indigenous Approach to Healing the Traumas of Colonialism. So just with this first slide, I want to share is my oldest daughter. Her name is Arundhati. And here you see her meditating, and you'll see as we go along why I believe that contemplative practices really hold a centerpiece in health and well-being, and what, how many of these different components come together in integrative health. Let's see here. All right, let's see if we can advance it. Okay, so I wanted to dedicate this presentation. I guess it's a little slow. It's going back. There you go. Well, all right, there you go. I wanted to dedicate this presentation to my mother and my father, especially my mother who just passed on the 25th of February. Both my mother and father believed in the old ways and spoke about them a lot. I want to also dedicate this talk to all those who have passed long before their time due to the diseases of Western civilization. And we've talked about some of that. David mentioned that earlier about the loss of land and the traumatic effect that it's had on many indigenous people around the world. I also dedicate this to all those who are struggling to heal from the traumas of colonialism, and to all those that continue the work of decolonization. I'm just so pleased to know that people are continuing to do this kind of work. This is a picture of our grandfather, Ron and I's grandfather. His name is Sitting Bear. He's one of our hereditary chiefs of the Arikara people. So I just wanted to say, well, you know, my ancestors are always looking, always watching me over my shoulder to make sure that I'm, you know, speaking right and speaking truth. So I just tonight, real quickly, want to talk about the medicine wheel, its connections to health and wellness. I want to dive into just a bit to colonization, decolonization, and talk about what happens to a body in a colonial situation. What are some things that are being found in neuroscience and molecular sciences related to health and illness? What kinds of things do we know now about indigenous healing practices? You know, that are really amazing to see. And finally, ending with how traditional practices can create resilient coping in the brain and the body to deal with trauma. So this slide here is one of my definitions for neurodecolonization in regard to decolonizing the mind and the body. And it's concerned with really what happens to the body and the brain under the colonial oppression that happens, all the way down to the molecular and cellular levels, including epigenetic expression and how our immune systems function. What does it mean in regard to our life expectancy, our physical and emotional illness and wellness? And there are a lot of really important implications, as you'll see as we go along. Neurodecolonization is really about also the bullet point number 2, engaging in traditional indigenous practices can really help us get well, help us to decolonize, you know, our mind and overcome the damaging effects of colonialism. Decolonization, all those activities that weaken the effects of colonialism, facilitate resistance and create these opportunities to promote traditional practices in present day settings. And again, to the left of that, you'll see 2 of my daughters when I lived in California. They used to come visit me in my office, and they'd make them practice mindfulness so they were calm in the offices. So when you look at the medicine wheel, when you think about the medicine wheel, all these different pieces sort of come together in it for me. Our brains, our microbes, our cellular and molecular systems, the genes, how they express, the lifestyles, the communities that we live in, and the help that we have are all shaped by the environment, how the relationship we had with our environment. And the important thing about it is that, you know, it's a whole system that has all these pieces that help pull together the harmony and balance and of the interaction of all living beings on Mother Earth. If we took a look at the medicine wheel on Turtle Island, I think folks will be very impressed to know that one of the oldest medicine wheels is pretty close to your territory down there in Colorado. It's this ancient medicine wheel in the Bighorn Mountains, which is calculated to be about 10,000 years old. And what's really cool about that is if you can think about, you know, at least 10,000 years ago when tribal people were coming from all parts of Turtle Island and converging in this place and meeting, sharing stories, sharing DNA, sharing innovations, sharing dances, and coming together at this place to kind of understand their place in the universe and the cosmology of their lives. People still come there today. They leave different kinds of gifts and acknowledgement of the spirits and the people that were here that came before us. They have prayer offerings, and of course, prayer flags. Colors are significant to Indigenous people, all people around the world. They have a very important meaning to them. And as you see these prayer flags here, then you can dash across the other side of the world and you can find the same colors that are expressed in Buddhist prayer flags. When you go into the Great Plains, especially in Canada and the United States, you'll see a lot of people who do the sun dance, and that's spread a lot since the 70s. And again, you'll see these colors with tobacco ties on them and the prayers that are offered. And again, like Buddhists, traditional Buddhist people, Indigenous people also participate in prayer for the world, for the balance and the harmony of the world. And of course, what we know is that Indigenous people, you know, paint themselves. This is a young man from the Amazon rainforest, a Chimene Indian. If you see these markings, the geometric patterns and the colors, of course, they're all significant, right? I was at the University of Kansas as a professor there, and just right down the road is Haskell Indian Nations University. It's used to be a residential school, a boarding school at one time. Students down there sort of reclaimed the land down there along with some of the professors, and they built this big medicine wheel out there. It's mowed, you can see, it's constructed. And to the left side, you'll see a water bird flying into the medicine wheel, which is kind of the influence of southern tribes and the geometric patterns. And you see people there all going out to the medicine wheel to contemplate, to pray, or maybe just on a tour. But this, again, is kind of hallowed ground now. It's where the children were taken away, but now it's a land that's been blessed, and hopefully it's helped release the spirits of this place to make their journey, these children that were stolen from home. There's a very important marker out in Eastern Cherokee territory. I was out there a few years ago, and this place called Judaculla Rock, the elders took me up there when I was doing a talk out there. And they showed me this rock, and then we got a closer look at the designs. And when I looked at the designs, I said, wow. And they told me that these were not just from one group, but these were from tribes from all over the place that were coming here, converging here, and leaving their markings in there. So you see all kinds of symbols, all kinds of figures. And in the middle, I always point that out, where you see the one being kind of with one leg on the line, walking up with maybe holding the hand of a child, and he's got these suction cups on his heads, and he's moving up on this path. He looks like he meets an animal, and he goes along until he goes up wherever he goes, right? And you can see it's from the late Archaic period, about 3,000 years ago. So as we were talking about 10,000 years ago in Wyoming, which is now Wyoming, and all on the eastern seaboard, which is now North Carolina, that tribes were converging all the time. And if you take a really close look at the right side, what do you see there? A lot of people say they see a turtle. So Turtle Island, you know, the language of Turtle Island has to be at least 33,000 years old, where people, you know, had these common stories. And in the Turtle Island, then you see the medicine wheel again. So it's, you know, it's a symbol that's been very, very significant, important. We also see it on rock carvings onto the right side, some of these ancient rock carvings. I had a lot of these, but I took out a lot of pictures. On our home reservation, where Ron and I come from, and some of the listeners tonight are from my reservation, 3 affiliated tribes, there's a big medicine wheel that was constructed after a Sundance one year in the 90s. So it's very significant. So what happened to that? All these different kinds of things and the ideas that Indigenous people had were affected by the colonization or the subjugation of Indigenous people by settlers that came into our territory. First it was the Europeans, and then later it was the Americans, so the descendants of the Europeans. If we look at this particular model, you'll see that, of course, there's an invasion period where there's an unwelcome intrusion phase. And I can say it's like COVID-19, for example, right? For some people, it invades their bodies, contaminates them, and then they get the infection. And that's the same thing that happens on a social and a cultural level. Cultural ideas that can be toxic and harmful can come in and contaminate a culture. And the culture then gets infected and overwhelmed, and sickness and decay and death begins to set in with that culture. The final phase of colonization is then when people survive the first 3 stages, they become colonized. They begin to accept or live with some of the beliefs and ideas and values, and they become part of their lives. We can all function. Those of us who are colonized people can function in a colonial society, but remain vulnerable to the structural and structures and processes of settler society. But one thing that's really important to note is that Indigenous resistance has always been ongoing with any time invasion has happened. So if you look at decolonization, decolonization, I put it in 3 phases. There's first this idea that in order to recover from all of the colonization that's occurred, communities or individuals have to engage in a cleansing period, stripping away these harmful, invasive practices and thoughts and belief systems that have been imposed by colonizing structures and people. Then there's a period of renaissance, which I think some of the ideas that I talk about are going to be make sense to you. There's the restoration of cultural practices, thinking and beliefs and ideas that were taken away or they were abandoned during the period of colonization, but we're recognizing that they are relevant and necessary for survival and well-being. And as I go along tonight, you'll see that there's implications for everybody, that the Renaissance should be happening for everyone, not just Indigenous people. And then there's the period of enlightenment where we or our children or our grandchildren, the next generations, give birth to new ideas, right? Or they use new ideas and thinking and technologies to contribute to the advancement of Indigenous people. Okay. So the medicine wheel looks like this in my work. There's the mind, there's the body, there's the spirit, and then there's the emotional. The mind part has to do now with a lot of the current Western science that's talking about neurogenesis, the growth of brain cells, and how that keeps you healthy, neuroplasticity, how the brain can change its structure and function when it learns new things. And also, I'm not going to talk about a lot of these tonight because I just don't have the time, but just to make a point that, you know, the body is beyond the physical body. We also have a whole ecology inside of us and on top of us, human microbiome, right, where we've got all these bacteria that many times are very, very essential for our health and our emotional health and physical health and well-being, protect us from cancers and traumas and all kinds of different chronic metabolic diseases. There are these contemplative practices I'll talk a bit about tonight. I'm not going to get a chance to talk about genetic inheritance and epigenetics, but I'll mention it as I go along and how it affects emotions. So what we know here is that, you know, our cultures and our experiences and our perceptions really affect our brain's plasticity. And I'm talking about plasticity all throughout the body. Our genes are plastic, you know, they change. Our cells are plastic, you know. So many things can change when we give it the right information and the right tasks. And on to the other side, in order to heal and transform from the diseases of colonization, we need to rediscover our ancestral knowledge and practices. When we do that, the plasticity of the mind and the body enables us to return to these practices and decolonize trauma and heal from the body, or heal the body and mind. So what is plasticity? It's probably, many of you have heard of this already, but it's the idea that our brain has the capacity to change throughout lifetime. Anytime we learn a new task, or every time we go back to an old task and we start changing it in the way, our brain begins to change. And what Sharon Begley says is that, you know, we're not stuck with the brain we're born with. We have the capacity to willfully direct the functions that are going to flower and those that wither, the moral capacities that emerge and those that do not, which emotions flourish and which ones are stilled. And as I get kind of closer to the end, you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of when I talk about how cognitive resilience happens in the body and how Indigenous people had some pretty clever ways of doing that. So as I said, cellular molecular structures, are damaged by colonialism, but they can change for the better through this willful direction of our lives and practices. Is that what I'm saying is returning back to these traditional practices. Neurodecolonization that I work on takes mindfulness, integrates it with Indigenous contemplative practices like ceremony to change the structure and function of the key regions of the brain. What we see now from brain imaging is when people involve themselves in these kinds of contemplative practices that are very meaningful, it begins to empower and change neurochemistry. Things like neurotransmitters and modulators begin to show up, and the duty that they're carrying out sometimes is speeded up or becomes stronger. It improves our epigenetic expression all the way down to the molecular and cellular enzymatic repair. So the goal behind neurodecolonization is to replace or prune these neural networks of negative patterns of thought that have come from colonialism, like I'm not good enough, or I'm this, or whatever those things that have been put into us, by the suppressive power and the emotions and behavior, and replace them with, healthy, productive, traditional structures. Which gets us to the story, this Cherokee story about the two wolves, which has become cutting edge research, right? So this story essentially says that, there was a grandfather talking to his grandson and says, there's a wolves battle going on inside me. The wolves are fighting. One is evil and it has all these really bad qualities like, regret and greed and arrogance and so on. And the other one's good. It has compassion and hope and serenity and truth and so on. And the grandson thinks about it for a minute and he says, grandfather, which one's going to win? And so the old Cherokee says, the one you feed. This has become kind of standard in the neuroscience in terms of neuroplasticity, in terms of positive behavior, positive action. Of course, it's like that in Buddhism too. It's the right speech, the right mind, the right thinking, you know, the right, all the right stuff, I guess I'll say. So when I think about what's happening at the smallest level, right? What's happened with trauma is that trauma changes us too as well, you know, and not for the best. When we get severe emotional or physical distress from negative experiences, then what I call molecular colonization happens. That traumatic decay or destruction is happening at these very, very small levels that make up the organism. Tiny, extremely minute particles or molecula called the tiny mass. For me, I think how these things begin is that they don't even have to be in your presence. It can be on another part of the world. And this is when I think about the subjugation of indigenous people started a long time ago. So already that, you know, that invasion was happening a long time ago when Columbus landed, you know, in this part of the world, in the Caribbean islands, that part. And of course, after the so-called discovery, Alexander VI called for this subjugation through this decree of the barbarous nations to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire. And this really important language here is that if a Christian enters the land of non-Christians, their lands become the possession of the discoverers, which is really interesting when you think about how you read the land acknowledgement tonight. That's exactly what happened. But the Pope, you know, Alexander didn't have another bullet point and said, you know, when they become Christians, you should give them back their land. You know, doesn't say that, right? That's something I think that's really important, is that, you know, that kind of subjugation continues today. Infection part of it is when, you know, genocide was happening. And this is a picture of that was drawn and given to Bartolomé de las Casas, who wrote this book called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies. As you look at that, you'll see, you know, what happens in this whole destructive phase, where you hear the stories of cutting on the right side. They're cutting the hands off of these indigenous people because they couldn't get a goal quickly enough. If you look closely, their noses are cut off and their hands are cut off. And you can see one, I don't know if you can see it here where I'm pointing to, where the eyes are being gouged out of this native man, and all these are being pushed off of cliffs. So this genocide was happening. And on this other side, you know, the conquistadors devised this very cruel way of torturing, where they hung all these indigenous people up on these pillars and put their feet just low enough so they could barely touch the ground, and lit fires under them, so that they would have to lift their feet and choke themselves. And when they wouldn't, they would step down. So it's very cruel. And you see this bashing the baby against the wall. So, you know, when you think about how long does the epigenetic expression last, right? So let's kind of journey on here. Well, in the 18th century colonialism in the United States, one of the things that the United States did was to be very, very clear about pointing out indigenous people as merciless Indian savages. And one of what's considered one of the most sacred documents in the United States today, one of the most sacred political documents, the Declaration of Independence. If you've seen this picture about Colombia and American progress, it's about manifest destiny. And as you look at this picture, again, what's centered here is this white woman with blonde hair, and if you look closer, she's got blue eyes, and she's got a Star of the Empire on the top of her head, and she's carrying a book. People think it's a Bible, and I said, well, you take a close look, it's a school book. And it's important because Bibles, you know, are, you know, they're optional, but school is compulsory to learn about the colonizers, you know, history. And if you look behind her, you'll see it's all light, and if you look in front of her, she's actually chasing away the darkness. You see that. But when you look closer, then what is she chasing? Well, then you'll look at the grizzly bear down here, and you see the wolf. And up here, you'll see the buffalo. All species that were nearly annihilated in you know, by settlers coming in. And of course, in the center here, you see indigenous people. Again, another group that was considered to be predators or beasts or whatever, wild animals, and they were almost completely wiped out too. By 1800, there were, I think, 250,000 indigenous people left in the United States. But has it gone away? Has it gone away since this 1872? Well, it hasn't. We still see Colombia being part of the Americana, right? We can still go to movies and still see Colombia. It's changed a bit, but it's there. So when we saw the stuff going on with George Floyd and how people were tearing down the monuments of these Confederate soldiers, then we see for indigenous people, these are all also very important markers to pay attention to of oppression. There were all the bannings that were going on by of ceremonial practices by different interior secretaries like Teller, who ordered an end to all heathenish dances and ceremonies because it was hard to civilize indigenous people. And of course, these were some of the first things in contemplative practices that were healthy for people, that were the first things that they attacked and banned. And he wasn't the only one. Hiram Price also said, no good reason why Indians should practice their traditional practices. They're repugnant to common decency and morality, and discourage them and stop the demoralizing influence of the heathenish rites. Thomas Jefferson Morgan also. This was happening in the 19th century, where native religions were not only suppressed, but medicine people, women and men who were healers were also put in prison for participating in religious dances and healing it and that sort of thing. The other thing was the big thing that a lot of us talk about is the abducting of native children, and that's happened in a number of places around the world. Indigenous kids have been taken from their homes. This wholesale kidnapping and placing them in these boarding and residential schools, forcing to assimilate, was one way to guarantee that these generations would not remember their traditional healing practices. And it really worked. It really worked. So if we look at continued colonization, we can see that the National Institute of Justice published this in 2016 about the lifetime intraracial violence. And here you see that the percentage of victims experiencing violence by an interracial perpetrator is very high, meaning that indigenous people experience violence by someone from another race more than any other group in the United States, more than any other group, right? I don't know if that's shifted, with all the hate crimes that have gone on against, Asians and so on, but this was for a long period of time. And then, of course, their own intraracial group violence is much lower, as you can see that. And this is a sign, no Indians or dogs allowed. So, molecular colonization. Well, after that trauma, what happens? Chronic stress sets in, and enzymatic colonization begins to occur, and the trauma and stress and the brain all begin to kind of take root. And what you're looking at here is a picture of what they call dendritic spines that are in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Very important structures, because they help us with our memory. They're important in learning, and they're important in movement. And of course, anything that we learn, these spines in the ends of the receptors take that up, and they begin to facilitate learning. And as you can see across the timeline, they're early postnatal. By adolescent, they're growing a lot, and some of them are being pruned. By early adulthood, there's some growing, some pruned, and finally at adulthood, you've got so many that are permanently there, where people are learning language, or they're learning movement, or expressing themselves. So that's what that's all about. But what we know is that chronic stress, hate crimes, being oppressed, feeling unsafe, always having to be careful when you're out there, or being discriminated against, produces a protein called kinase C that floods the brain and begins to break down these dendritic spines. And of course, then a lot of problems start to happen. Loss of memory, loss of learning, and so on. And that happens at very early ages. What we know, there's a gender difference that happens between males and females. But we also know that dendritic spines in healthy people really provide cognitive resilience against Alzheimer's disease. And not surprisingly, Alzheimer's disease has become a really big thing among Indigenous people in Turtle Island. The bottom line is, when you begin to stop the chronic stress, they can repair. They can, and when stress is eliminated. So that's a really positive thing. I put this slide in because I thought it was really important when I think about how the relationship between Indigenous mothers and babies are. And this was some research that went on to show that mothers carry genetic material from their children that actually ends up in their brains and ends up in different parts of their body. This particular study, and bullet point number 2, talks about how fetal cells are sprinkled throughout a mother's brain and body. That when the study was looking at women's brains, some women who had gotten Alzheimer's disease and dementia, what they found in the brains of women, they had the male DNA in their brains, the male brain cells, and from their sons. And those cells were actually still alive, and it was theorized they're still communicating with mom, talking with mom, right? It's part of the evolutionary survival mechanism that we have, so that they're talking to mom, and the brain cells are saying, pick me up, mom. I'm scared, mom. Hug me, mom. Don't get too far away from me, mom. And that's how we survive as a species, because, a baby's cry doesn't necessarily bring a mother because the mother gets upset the baby's crying, but it could be that also that the cells that are talking in mom's brain helps heighten that experience. What's really interesting about this too, and very important, is that those cells also help mom in really important ways. For example, in this particular study, when women had a heart event, a number of those cells migrated to the site of the injury on the mom's heart, and they begin to patch up mom's heart. Some of them even start beating to try to get mom's heart beating. So, this is how close we are with our children, right, mothers? This is how close we are at the cellular molecular level. So again, if you can think about that, I always think about what must have been going on when all these kids were taken from their mothers, and how their mothers must have had these cells activating in their brains, their children saying, where are you, mom? Pick me up, mom. Take care of me, mom. So it's not just that they're taken away, but it affects generations of mothers. And it sets into motion a lot of molecular and cellular and genetic changes in mothers. If you can imagine it for a second. And that's why most of us can't even imagine losing a child, but then to have your children just forcibly removed generation after generation. So that, hope that puts a different spin on when we think about, when we remove children from their, like we do with social workers, from their parents, right? So also at a molecular structure, there is the telomere at the end of a chromosome, and the telomere is really a lot about keeping the integrity of the chromosome, right? Keeping it fusing from into another chromosome and deteriorating, but also protects our genetic data, and also protects us from things like the diseases of old aging and cancer. Every time our cells divide, telomeres get shorter. When the cells get too short, they can no longer divide, they become inactive or senescent. They don't really die, this says it dies, but they're senescent cells kind of hang out in our body. And one of the things that Indigenous people used to do to get rid of their senescent cells, and all we all did, was fast. We enter a state of what's called autophagy. When you're fasting for so many hours and your body gets into fasting for like 18 hours, your body begins to eat itself at the molecular level, eating mutated cells, cancer cells, different kinds of genetic junk that it doesn't need, that can start emitting toxic material and become cancerous. So the shortening of telomeres is associated with the diseases of aging, cancer, and higher death, right? What we know is that middle-aged people who are active have higher aerobic capacities, longer telomeres, and that's very important. Theirs are similar to young people. But again, stress is so powerful is that, this study said that they're still short for people who are depressed and people who are healthy, who are showing chronic stress. So this kind of takes away the idea that you can go do your CrossFit for an hour and then sit there the rest of the day and stress at your office, so on. And of course disturbs the cortisol, which of course creates more stress and of course increases the telomere length, or decreases the telomere length, which again has a lot of implications for people that live in communities where there's a lot of stress. And again, a lot of these are Indigenous people. We know that it happens to children, and it's associated with a stressful home or community. And also, in this particular study, it looked at children living in the most challenging environments had shorter telomeres, which means, that's not a good thing, right? They're biologically older than kids who are living in the most nurturing and loving settings. So when you think about the number of kids that have been removed from their homes and put into foster care, or where these issues are going on, you can almost bet that they are already have inherited shorter telomeres from their mothers who have gone through the stress, and they are like the ticking time bomb too as well. So we don't see that as social workers. All we see is what we see on the outside and sort of the social and maybe some of the psychological things we talk about. This is taking us down to another level. We know so that the telomeres can also be colonized by the lifestyle. And this is something that's been clear about a lot of Indigenous women in different Indigenous cultures that didn't have this problem before colonization, was being overweight or obese. We know now that mothers who are exposed to these life factors have shorter telomeres. They pass on directly to their children. I'm one of those people. My mother was overweight, quite overweight when she gave birth to me, and I looked at her DNA, and I've got all the short telomeres that she has, or the probability of shorter telomeres, right? What are the factors then that shorten telomeres? Well, hate crimes. I said missing and murdered Indigenous women, abuse, poverty, isolation, violence, mocking of Indigenous people like we had for the last 4 years with Donald Trump calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. The ridicule, the exclusion, the stereotyping, the sex trafficking, the fear, the lack of safety, the tropes or the memes of hate like the Indian princess or the squaw or the drudge. These are all things that still exist yet in society. So again, when these things exist and it's stressing out mother, and it's also, we can almost guarantee that this is going to baby too as well. And we'll go on to another generation until this stops and it gets healed. BDNF, a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is a protein that is produced in the brain, promotes neuron growth and protects the neurons from dying, and it's very important. I'll talk a little bit about how that happens, but this particular slide here talks about how bullying can happen here, and I'd say this bigger aggressive white mouse bullying the smaller Indigenous mouse, brown mouse, I'm sorry, did I say Indigenous? The white mouse bullying the Indigenous, okay. Creating stress. Prolonged stress creates an increase of BDNF in the brain, and that's a good thing because the little mouse's brain is being protected. But the longer that goes on, the bullying and the BDNF is up, it activates genes in the front part of the body or brain that produce these higher levels of social anxiety, withdrawal, and depression. Goes on long enough, then the BDNF then signals. It participates in what they call this pathophysiology of depression and suicidal behavior. Wow, think about that for a second. Again, we can go back. I don't have time to show slides, but one of the highest level of diagnoses for Indigenous people around the world living in the colonial context is depression, anxiety, suicidal behavior. That's pretty clear. So now we kind of know what's going on at the molecular level with people when they get bullied, they get oppressed, they feel unsafe. How do we decolonize the mind then? Well, I'm only going to talk about this piece here about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, the mind part. But if we go into it, I've identified from the research 12 mindfulness practices that can really heal our emotions, reset our genetic expression, facilitate and improve our learning. I call it the new, the old Indigenous social work. It's new because people are just talking about it new, like it's new now, but it's old because these are things that Indigenous people did for a long time. Like they moved, we were meant to move. They slept very differently. A lot of laughter and humor, hanging out with your tribe, your people, fasting, meditation, putting themselves in situations where their cells had to adapt to different kinds of stress, like sitting in a really hot sweat lodge or a sauna, if you're Sami from Finland or Norway, and or sitting in ice cold pools, same thing. And of course, being outside. What we know about running is that running is very important for Indigenous people in particular, because we're closer to our ancestors than as hunter-gatherers than a lot of settlers are. Settlers that have grown up, in a farmer society have, probably don't have the need to be hunter-gatherer moving as much as we do as Indigenous people. Well, we evolved to move. It improves our fitness, our mental health, physical health, our brains, processing speed, everything that I've talked about in terms of the BDNF, the miracle grow for the brain. If you run, that miracle grow, the BDNF helps more neurons grow, protects your brain from things like Alzheimer's and degenerative diseases, which again is another reason why a lot of people in industrial society get dementias, is because they don't move, they don't run, they don't raise their heart rates. The last one I think is probably the most important for our discussion tonight is the regular endurance exercise. And I'm not talking about running, marathons every day, but running a certain distance at a certain pace is kind of in our culture, is in our heritage as human beings. Causes adaptations of what they call kynurenine metabolism that protects us from depression, right? Increases this skeletal muscle kynurenine aminotransferase, CAT in other words, which shifts the metabolic expression away from this neurotoxic kynurenine when we just sit around, right? And it seems to doubly affect Indigenous people when we sit around. It has higher effect to the production of kynureninic acid, which then that's the cure for depression. Get up and move. And for Indigenous people having such a high level of depression, this is one of the things that was colonized about them, was they colonized their movement. They could not go from one camp to the next camp, or from one hunting ground to the other, or from one gathering place to another. Colonial, settlers kind of cut that out and said that you can only stay on this reservation. Of course, this is where these rates went up, right? Or you can only stay in this part of the place, right? The rest of it's all private property or whatever. Singing and dancing, very important, something that's so important with Indigenous people. This particular study, 2018, so you see it's relatively new, showed that singing, which Indigenous people have done a lot of, and I know that my relatives in Altera, I were there, they were singing, and we go back home, Ron and I, we hear a lot of people singing, but they sang even more than that, right? Increases the levels of endocannabinoids in this particular study of postmenopausal females. But again, this has been replicated with other populations. Endocannabinoids also go up when you dance and when you cycle, when you move, positive effects. Singing, the most beneficial activity in this study, pushed up the endocannabinoids. And what are endocannabinoids? But they are these biochemical messengers, right? That improve the mood, reduce stress and anxiety, enhance memory. And here we go again, protect brain function and improve, reduce pain. So that's why I ask when I talk to social workers, I say, well, is that one of your things you do when you clinical practice? Do you have people dancing and singing? Here's the evidence for it. I mean, if you're working with Indigenous people, you're going to see that this is the thing that a lot of people just don't do with Indigenous people. Here's an interesting story that kind of underlines this. After the Rwandan genocide that happened, the Rwandan prescription for depression was sun, drumming, dancing, and community. And this was a quote that Andrew Solomon got, who's a writer from some of the participants. He said, we had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers who came here immediately after the genocide. We had to ask some of them to leave. And their practices did not involve being out in the sun where you begin to feel better. There was no music or drumming to get your blood flowing again. There was no sense that everyone had taken the day off so the entire community could come together to try to lift you up and bring you back to joy. Remember that? I went back to all these Native American or these American Indian commissioners were trying to stop these ceremonies, right? These heathen ceremonies. They didn't want them dancing. They didn't want them, you know, being indigenous, right? There was no acknowledgement of the depression as something invasive and external that you could actually be cast out again, like you could actually exorcise depression, right? Sinhalese also talked about that too as well. Instead, they would take people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and have them sit around for an hour or so and talk about bad things that had happened. We had to ask them to leave. And so, you know, it's a very different worldview when we start talking about trauma. I know a lot of people are writing about trauma in the United States, but I don't know if people are looking at this in terms of trauma. With the you know, people in Senegal talk about, Senegalese say, spirits are to the people of Senegal as microbes are to the Americans. They are all over us. Some are good, some are bad. And that, Ron and I grew up with that kind of talk about spirits and our people and that sort of thing, right? And this whole idea that, you know, you can heal, you know, through all these different kinds of indigenous practices. Humor, another big thing here. Important, you know, laughter is important. It comes down to DNA differences and why people like myself, I've got this particular genetic variant, smile, laugh more. This it's called the serotonin transporter gene. People with short alleles, bullet point number 3, flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of laughing, there's teasing, there's smiling, there's humorous stories. There's, you know, that's part of culture. That's part of indigenous culture. Teasing and laughter, telling jokes, that sort of thing. It was even part of different ceremonies. You know, when there was a very serious ceremony, different tribes had sacred clowns that would come in and make the people laugh during a very sacred and solemn time, right? It was a healing thing. Laughing, of course, increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, protecting your brain again, improves memory and learning, lowers cortisol and other adrenaline-like factors, relaxes blood vessels, boosts T cells, all the way down to, again, raises endocannabinoids, right? Feel good. I mean, this is the kind of stuff we should have been doing in social work for a long, long time, right? And these are, again, this is knowledge of indigenous people. So this is how it looks. Humor, collectivism, all come together. People who have this particular gene, this serotonin transporter gene, if they're not, you know, it does, when they laugh, it confers protection upon them. When they don't, it makes them more susceptible. Humor. This is what it looks like around the world. And of course, no big surprise, we have a lot of serious folks here in these European sort of British and American sort of places, but as you get, you'll see more, you know, people of color in Mexico and Taiwan and places. I would suspect, you know, indigenous people, if they looked at, you know, this, they would see a lot of people up there, would have a lot of people with this particular particular allele, genetic factor. Because we see it here in these short alleles, which is the ones that, again, I'm talking about laughter and people being susceptible to depression. Native Americans, you can see 42% of us have this particular short allele. You know, I say 42 people that are susceptible to depression or have the funny bone, right? Caucasians, 12 or 24% on the way down to African American. Along alleles, you know, you don't have the funny bone. Kind of gets down to, you know, 13, 14, or I mean, I'm sorry, you do, yeah, right. So that's Caucasian again, 29%, right? Now it's not all strictly science, but it just shows some trends here. When you look even closer then about indigenous people in South America, you'll see that hunter-gatherer populations have a large number of people with this particular genetic variant. So humor, laughter, communalism, sharing, really important. Agriculturalists, traditional agriculturalists are even a little bit higher. You know, they like to laugh, they love to tell stories, they love humor, they love to be together. You break them up, you invade their territory, you ban their ceremonies, they commit suicide, they die. Sleep's the same thing. We have a molecular clock. You know, we have to make sure that our molecular clock is in sync. But the whole purpose of looking at this, you know, thing is that our sleep has been colonized, right? And this is when sleep, we know that now that when we go to sleep at night, if we sleep deeply enough, kind of at that 4th level of sleep, the brain does clearance of the amyloid proteins, which are the first hallmark of Alzheimer's. And we don't sleep well in an industrial society. You know, it's a lot of disturbed sleep, which is one of the reasons people theorize that Alzheimer's has grown. I mentioned the sweat lodge and these hot environments, that this is what they call mild bioenergetic stress, that this is why Indigenous people challenge themselves sitting in real cold environments, like in cold pools, ice water, or sitting in hot sweat lodges, or like Sami people sitting in saunas, right? And what we know about this is that that mild bioenergetic stress then helps maintain protein integrity. Proteins can get misfolded, and when they misfold, it's a sign of disease. When you expose people to sitting in a hot sauna, for example, 5 times a week for 20 minutes for at 180 degrees Fahrenheit, it can increase what they call heat shock proteins, which are a sign of longevity and healthy skeletal muscles, disease protection. Fasting, the same thing. One of the things we know about fasting is that Indigenous people were doing this for a long time, and I just thought I would share this slide too, because in this slide you have this Jesuit missionary, Paul Lejeune, who was among these hunter-gatherers in 1636, observing them, right? He thought they had all these high qualities, but he also thought they were savages too. But one of the things he said in his journals is he was talking about they hadn't eaten for a while, but yet they were still, you know, doing their work and laboring, but they were still cheerful, and he was suffering, you know, and they were telling him, you know, we go many days without eating, you know, and telling him, said, you know, it's like they're teaching him, this missionary, you know, let thy soul to be strong and endure suffering and hardship. Keep thyself from being sad, otherwise thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. Which then to me, I said, wow, this makes so much sense when I think about how Indigenous people have humor even in their suffering, right? They used to have this humor. But when you take them and put them in a residential school, you put them someplace and you say, don't laugh about that. That's inappropriate. That you got to be serious, right? Then what you're doing is you're changing the genetic expression, the epigenetic expression of someone who needs to have that humor to deal with that stress, to deal with that hunger, to deal with, you know, the oppression, right? And that's just why they had, I said earlier, some people had sacred clowns in their villages to keep people laughing, even during the hard times, right? Intermittent fasting has all these different important benefits, but protects the neurons, you know, from all these different diseases, reduces blood pressure, all the way down to, as I said, it imposes a challenge to cells, and the cells respond and they enhance their ability to cope. We get stronger, right, when we go without food, and when we can laugh at it, helps us resist disease. That's why intermittent fasting now has become a huge thing in you know, industrialized world, because of so much obesity. Now everyone's writing like they're the experts of it, but this is really old stuff. I mentioned autophagy, when your body begins to eat itself, eats cancer, and Indigenous peoples have high rates of cancer, blood cancers in particular. We know now from the research that when we fast, we actually greatly reduce different kinds of cancers, and that's right now become part of the protocol in cancer treatment. Outside, of course, we know is very important. We know that there's what Richard Louv calls the nature deficit disorder, and being outside is so important. I won't talk much about that, but we do have this epidemic of inactivity and the devaluing of independent play, right? Most neuroscience shows that if you return to this kind of thing, again, you begin to raise people's optimism, endocannabinoids, protect their brain. You begin to shift, you know, and repair telomeres and also the dendritic spines in the brain, just by doing some of these simple things. Now, these are folks from my our tribe here, from Arikara people, and they're singing to this sacred cedar tree. And as they sing this songs to this tree, Atna, you know, mother or grandmother, it's a female, and as they sing to the tree, they treat the tree like it's sentient. The tree is alive. They believe it's alive. That's all they need to do, is to have that belief, to know it's a being just like them, and they sing to this tree. They sing their sacred songs. What's cool about this is that now we know that when people get into this really deep contemplative prayer and ceremony, amazing things happen to the body. I mentioned all these other things happening to the cells and to the molecular structures and so on in the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but also different parts of the brain shut down. In this case, on the right side of the brain, the back part of the brain, the parietal lobe, which expresses for visual spatial reasoning and tells me, I am not that tree. That tree is not me. I'm here, and that's the tree. But as we sing to that tree, and the tree sings back to us, and we form this strong relationship, all of a sudden the distance between the tree and these men goes away. Because that part of the brain is no longer saying we're separate. They become one with the tree, with the branches, with the bark, with the needles, with the roots, with the fragrance. When you go and look at Buddhism and you look at a lot of the different healers and great spiritual leaders around the world, when they reach this level of transcendence and they could touch and all these things and realize these things were alive, that's what was happening, and that they weren't separate from them. That's what was happening in their brain. The parietal lobe on the right side was quieting down so they could make this really deep spiritual connection. These are the things, again, I just want to remind you that colonizers took away from indigenous people. This is what, created the sickness among the people. We also know that this is, again, inside one of our earth lodges, that when people are in indigenous practices, healing practices, ceremonial practices, it changes the brain waves on this part here. Brain waves change to a healthy function. On the other side, we see language, and this is really also the prayer part of the brain that's activated, right? This part of the brain here too is a part of the brain that is optimistic. It's called the left prefrontal cortex when a person's having a really strong positive experience. Language part of the brain. This part of the brain is called the insula, and that's also about conflict and also about emotional intelligence. So when we put it all together, we see things like, the brain changing, we see the DNA as well as the telomeres changing, the neurochemistry changing, brainwaves changing, parietal lobe going quiet, and also the telomeres healing. So just a couple more slides here. This one here is also a slide where when we think about where does the sacred live in the brain, right? Is there a God spot in the brain? Well, there's a sacred place. I just put this up, just for, I don't know, just to draw people's attention to it. But this part of the brain, the parietal lobe, like I just talked about, the brain is the spot where there's an overlap, where this is where spirituality happens, the part of the brain that gets activated, that we're seeing in another slide. What we know about this is, which I think is very cool, is that we know the spirituality zone is that, the people have a belief in a higher power. It doesn't have to be God the way Christians believe in God, but something's going on. A lot of indigenous people say the great mystery, right? This is, moves in all these ways for a particular reason, right? But what the research says, had been an evolutionary asset. It's helped us survive. The key, though, is whether you believe in a loving or a loving God or a God of retribution. When I've looked at indigenous people's religion, I looked at the literature, it's very hard to find any one religion or indigenous belief system where they says, God is going to get you, God's going to do this to you, right? Most of the time with indigenous religions or spirituality, it's like, love the plants, love everything, love the animals, you're a part of the web, right? Whereas Christianity, when it came here, there was a God of retribution, right? And so the studies that have been done, a guy by the name of Andrew Newberg wrote this book, How God Changes Your Brain, looked at people in the US believed in 3 types of God, or 4 types of gods. One was the God of retribution, the critical God, the distant God, and the one was the benevolent God. The benevolent God says, love everything. And I said, well, that's closest to what indigenous people believed. The critical, the distant, or the God of retribution is out to get you, which I think was the first kind of religion that was introduced during those times when a lot of indigenous people became Christians because they were afraid, they had no power and they ended up becoming Christians. So a lot of them picked up the God of retribution or the critical God. very different from what their ancestors were believing in. Last two slides here. So everything I've talked about tonight then gets back to the idea that if we're fasting, if we're running and moving, if we're singing and dancing, if we're, I see I got 5 minutes, okay, I see the sign. If we're singing and dancing, if we're sleeping well, if we're doing these things that I mentioned, sorry I had to go through them so quickly, cognitive resilience begins to happen in the body, and this is what a brain image looks like of it. We know that cognitive resilience is this ability to overcome negative stress on our brain's functioning. And here we see it on the left side, activated and risky coping. There's no activation there. In fact, there's a lot of parts of the brain in blue that are shutting down. Below that, it says, however, prior experience and training to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty may improve cognitive resilience. I always love to tell this story because when I was down in Yurok and Wiyot and Hoopa territory, I got a chance to visit with some of the elders and the intellectuals, and I learned a lot about how some of those tribal people down there prepared their young people for hardship and for stress and uncertainty. And as I heard these stories and how they just didn't do it on the weekend or like they were Eagle Scouts or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. This was a rite of passage all through life so that they would learn how to deal with, the stress and by running up mountains at night or swimming in the open ocean where there were great white sharks and to kind of improve their cognitive resilience. So if you can think about that for a second, about this part of the brain activating in the prefrontal cortex, in the frontal lobe, it's implicated in the processing of fear and risk. That's exactly what it does. Helps us process our risk and fear as we live in life, right? Also inhibits our emotional responses, so that we can be cool under pressure and we aren't crying out or yelling out or getting scared, right? We're always thinking about how to maintain the situation, keeping our cool. In other words, it also implicated decision-making and self-control. So as I listened to some of my friends and the scholars and the intellectuals and elders talk about this, I was like so fascinated. One of my students came to my office one day and brought me this paper from an anthropologist. And then I start reading about exactly what some of these elders and intellectuals were telling me about. At the end of the article, I'll have to find it, it's one of my boxes around here. It said that the people in the tribe that had gone through these rites of passage all through their lives, became some of the most courageous, brave, compassionate, and moral people in the tribe. And I said, wow, look at this. This part of the brain is also involved in the cognitive evaluation of morality and how to treat one another. So all these things that Indigenous people were doing that were banned and taken away, that they forgot, were things that kept them at this state where they lived with things even worse than COVID-19. They lived with all kinds of climate change, different kinds of disasters, earthquakes, starvation, droughts, all these kinds of things. And we're here today because they lived that kind of life. So I'm going to just go ahead and end my talk here and see. I guess we'll return back to see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. So I will read questions from the Q&A for about the next 15 minutes to you. Is there a place in the decolonization healing work to use non-native modalities as well, philosophies and medicine? And if so, in what way could they be used or integrated?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm saying that, some of these things like movement is a human expression. Sleeping well is a human expression. Dancing and singing are all human expressions. What I'm saying is that those things were banned from Indigenous people and they had to work really hard to get those back. So Western modalities, a lot of times we think about Western modalities, sometimes we're thinking about psychotherapy, which has its place in some instances. We think of psychotherapists, I suppose, in tribal people, they used to be the elders with a lived experience, not with just, a training, educational experience, but the lived aged experience. So it may be something more akin to that, because people get better with age, as they say, But other therapies, I think You know, I'm sure there's a place for drug therapies. I'm not really qualified to tell you which ones. What I can tell you is there are a lot of drug therapies that are used that really are outperformed by things like movement and running and singing and dancing for depression and anxiety and emotional disorders like that. So I think you have to be very careful about that, and there needs to be a new DSM-4 or 5, 6 or whatever written, you know, that talks about the integration of indigenous therapies that has this really strong evidence base. I mean, it's thousands of years old. It's not like, you know, study someone did for 6 weeks or, you know, whatever, you know, with a, so, or even a longitudinal study that lasted 100 years. We're talking about therapies that have lasted for, you know, millennia. So,
okay. I think this one is a similar question or related to it. Can the model of healing using cultural practices be applied to all tribes and peoples?
I think, you know, I think it can. I mean, again, I think I'm really stoked about this model because I think it's very fundamental, and it has all these aspects to it, and the evidence base is very strong. And that's why a lot of the people that are writing books are kind of taking these one piece at a time and saying, you know, you should do a little more of this, a little more of that. So yes, I think it can be applied to large populations.
Okay. Kindly comment on the fact that every indigenous culture has a version of the medicine wheel. The original tribes of Asia do mindful practice methods using the powers of the directions and numerous versions of the power animals. So kindly reflect on how to work with the medicine wheel in a whole earth way.
Boy, I'm not qualified to give that advice. I'm not a spiritual leader. I'm just talking about how this makes sense to me in terms of putting you know, this indigenous science and Western science, indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge together. So I don't know. I've never, you know, I've seen, of course, how those kinds of models are used, but I don't know enough about them to comment intelligently about it. So.
Okay. This one is a pitch, I suppose, to the graduate students and undergrads in the audience. Academia in my graduate school pushes back on my goal of decolonizing myself and the world around me in science. Do you have any advice for us 20 to 30-year-old Indigenous peoples still trying to find ourselves whilst working towards decolonization? How do we protect ourselves from burnout and losing hope?
Yeah, I think you know, some of the things I've talked about I think are very important. It's really again the practice of these things, right? How do you live these things in your life? You know, do you move? Do you dance? Do you sing? Do you speak your language? You know, and you know, something that's very powerful is being around your people. You know, having that humor and being around folks, getting those lifts. You know, beyond that, I mean, that's how I was successful in my academic career too. Is I depended a lot on classmates and people at home to kind of continue to encourage, and you know, and it had some protection, you know, some protection that was gifted to me by some elders that I wore, that I kept on me, right? So I mean, and the other thing is you know, one colleague told me one time when I was in my PhD program, she said, because I felt like dropping out because the system was so colonized, and she got a hold of me, and she was I think she was Menominee, maybe that was her tribe, and she said, you know, you belong here. She said, they need your voice here. You need to, they don't let them chase you away. You know, you need to say this. They need to hear what you have to say. So that was really good for me, and I think that's what really helps, is that if you have mentors, you know, mentors are very, very important. You know, they were very important for me. So.
Okay. We have a guest from overseas here. Kia ora, I'm an Indigenous mindfulness researcher in New Zealand. One question that I've encountered is looking at the location of the mind from an Indigenous perspective. Many of the stories that I've heard, and from my experiences as a Maori woman, the mind and thoughts emerge from the solar plexus. the idea of the mind being located in the brain is possibly a colonial perspective. I would love to know your thoughts on this, Dr. Yellowbird.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Kira. So thank you for that question. I appreciate it. One of the things I didn't get a chance to get to, but I'm working on it in this book, is the idea that we have, trillions of brains inside of us. I'm talking about the human microbiome that exists, as you talk about, in the center of our body, right? We know that, and we knew this, I suppose, for some time, that those what are referred to as bacteria, and it's always kind of a bad name, but this is what I call the new great circle of life that exists inside of us, exert a very, very powerful influence on our mental health, on our thinking. Their genes actually express and talk to our genes and help us make decisions. That's why you get the gut feeling and that sort of stuff. I mean, that science has been incredible. That's been churned out, and people, when Westerners came, that's the first thing they did, is they wanted to kill all the bacteria. They looked at indigenous people and said, "Oh, these people, they're not clean people," or whatever. But they were coming from a situation in Europe, though, where they were coming from the bubonic plague and from all these infectious diseases that they had spread through the domestication of animals and living close, in cloistered cities and that sort of thing. So when they saw our people, they were afraid because, it reminded them of another time, but they didn't realize we didn't have these infectious diseases. They brought those. So I do believe that, this idea that, we do have all this energy and all this sort of intelligence that lives inside of us in different ways, I think is always you've got this feedback loop, this brain gut axis that's talking all the time. And that's why indigenous foods and indigenous fasting and all those things are so important for our brains and for us, being able to kind of develop a sense of centeredness and identity and well-being. So
great. There's a lot of information these days on mindfulness practice and workshops. I will say a lot of that's going on campus here. Is there a particular kind of mindfulness practice that dovetails closely with indigenous cultures? And do you find links with Buddhism and his work?
Well, first thing I'll say is Buddha was indigenous. Most people don't realize that.
Yep.
Buddha was indigenous. I think settlers got a hold of Buddha and made him something he wasn't, right? And so that's the first thing. Buddha wasn't a Buddhist either, Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. Anyways, but what I have been working on is a practice called mindful decolonization. Mindful decolonization is the idea, as I talked about neurodecolonization early on, is what kinds of practices are going to empower the mind, the body, the human microbiome, and change the genetic expression and repair the cellular and molecular systems in the body. So it's not just, when we think about Buddhism, a lot of times we think mostly about sitting practice. Sometimes people talk about, mindful walking or mindful eating. I don't see many people do that, right? But people talk about it in mindful sitting. So mindful decolonization is an idea that, we're going to prune away this bad stuff that comes from colonialism. And, we're going to reclaim our land. We're going to reclaim our dignity and our sovereignty, those kinds of things with settlers, because settlers have to be decolonized. They're very colonized. So reconciliation has to happen. The only way reconciliation has to happen is settlers have to understand, the wrongs that they did. And the only way they can understand the wrongs that they did and accept that and repatriate, that was taken, is for them to develop, as Buddhism says, the right thinking, the right action, like the Eightfold Path. Also, what they have to develop is a sense of compassion, a sense of understanding, and that's enlightenment, right? Until then, there's no such thing as enlightenment to me. It's people going through the motions. So mindful decolonization then helps us investigate and do practices that help us move through colonialism and prepare us to make structural changes. That's what the practices are all about. May I move through the ruins of colonization, as I breathe in, as I breathe out. May I change the structure of oppression. may I have the courage to do that, right? I've constructed a number of practices to kind of teach settlers and indigenous people about that. So it's very different. I think about mindful decolonization as changing structural systems and processes in colonialism. It's not about the individual and reducing stress. That's a good thing, but we have to have a broader transformation.
So here's a broader question and then several follow-up ones drill into specifics. With so many different ways to partake of neurodecolonization, do you recommend doing all of them or picking out specific methods that work for an individual?
Well, I mean, that's really up to a person in their life, what you can fit in, you know. I mean, some is better than nothing. And I think, you know, the thing we know about life now is that what keeps people healthy and balanced is dealing with complexity, right? I'm not talking about multitasking, but dealing, you know, learning how to deal with. Well, let me kind of rephrase that. The biggest thing to protect your brain, your body, your health, your well-being, is to create a very rich environment where you're challenged to do different kinds of things throughout the day. And I'm not talking about like just work, but your movement, you know, your thinking, your focus, you know, your singing, your dancing, your laughter. How many times have you laughed today? In fact, that's one of the things I was going to tell social workers. I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but you know, I mean, if I was doing an assessment now as a social worker, that's the first thing I'd say is like, how many times, that would be my assessment, I'd have laughter and humor. How many times did you laugh today, right? And would say, well, one would be circle one, it would be like I giggled today, and the other one would be, you know, 10 where I laughed till I peed on myself kind of thing, right? Or how many times did you laugh this week? How well did you sleep this week? How many times did you dance? How many times did you sing this week, right? And how did you feel when you did that? Those are the kinds of things that we'll end up at some point doing, I think, with this new research, as social work kind of continues to make the leap towards something that gets us out of this entrenched way of thinking that you know, those things aren't important. So to me, I try to do those as much as I can and kind of integrate them into my life. You know, I dance with my daughters, my wife sometimes. I'm out in my garage. I retooled it during the COVID, and I dance out there. You know, I used to be a grass dancer at one time, but you know, what I'm learning now is I'm kind of learning how to do the Lindy Hop, because it's complex movements. I was even looking at doing the tango, right? But then I started looking at other dances, tribal dances like bear dances and buffalo dances and eagle dances, and I'm like, wow, this is what all these tribes did. They did all these different kinds of things, and they practiced them, right? And then they learn new things, new forms. So I think that's the thing, is changing it up, learning new things and doing as much as you can. I mean, there are things that are fundamental. You should sleep well. You should move, right? And you know, I suppose laughter is optional, but you know, I highly recommend it. You know.
Okay. This is sort of the flip side of a single coin. How do foods figure into this ideal? That's one question from, and a different one was, are there any other ways to gain the effects of the benefits of fasting, especially for those who can't due to medical reasons?
Yeah, well, the first one, food, you know, I mean, one of the things I did this last few years is I've really been on a genetic sort of exploration kick, and I've done a lot of DNA tests for myself and my mother, and I've studied a lot and realized, you know, the diseases that happen to Indigenous people in particular are really due to a lot of genetic variants that they have or don't have that protect them from certain kinds of foods. For example, I have a particular genetic variant called the hunter-gatherer phenotype. It's a CLTC1 TT variant, so I have double copies, which means that, you know, if I don't limit my processed carbs or I don't limit my sugar, I'm going to get diabetes and obesity. I've got all the markers there for a hunter-gatherer. I mean, I should be moving a lot every day. When I sit around, I don't burn as much metabolic, I don't have as much metabolic activity as other people do, which means that I probably come from a line of people, someplace in my past, Indigenous people that went through starvation periods. So one of my great grandmothers, or way back when, sent me with that gene, so that if there was a famine today and I ate, I would retain all that food And I wouldn't, I'd be, if you see a lot of indigenous people or people who are indigenous who are obese, they probably have that genetic variant. They'd be the first ones to survive a starvation period or a famine period. So I always suggest to people, if you're interested, start reading in evolutionary psychology and biology are really good areas to read. So food, we know that for some people, like myself, who have hunter-gatherer phenotypes, I should say, we need a lot of fiber. And we can eat a lot of carbs, but they have to be corn and beans, for example. Corn, like traditional corn and beans make the most sense for my diet, right? And this is why it's worked so well. But when you start adding different kinds of fats to that, there wasn't that much fat back in the day. The buffalo were very different and so on. So today, when people eat processed meats or industrial meats and those kinds of things, they're taking in not only the hormones and stuff, but they're also taking in a lot of the bad fats and the lack of nutrients that are in the foods. So the idea, of course, is nutrient-dense foods, but it makes so much sense. And again, this is some point I predict in the future that social workers will do this with people. They'll have people doing nutrigenomic tests where they get a swab of their saliva, they send it to a provider, they come back, they read it and say, wow, you shouldn't be eating eggs. You shouldn't be eating, 4 times a week. You should only eat them 1 time a week because you're going to get a heart attack. Or you shouldn't be eating this because you're going to get diabetes. Or this, if you drink Diet Coke, this is going to activate, and you don't run, you're a sure case of depression, and so on. So that's what I think about diet. I think about not just food, but all the other pieces that are attached to it. So.
Okay, this will be the last question. If we're not working directly with Indigenous peoples, what are some actions we can take more broadly to apply this ideology?
Well, like I said, I think a lot of this stuff makes sense, and that's why Western science is doing it now, and people are buying into it. People are spending, hundreds of millions of dollars for testing, for DNA testing, and for food and nutrigenomic testing, and they're also looking at the science. I mean. Where a lot of the science is coming from are from hunter-gatherer populations that still are hunter-gatherers today, whether the Chimene Indians down in the rainforest, or whether they're Sami people in Finland, or whether they're people in Altira or wherever, where there are indigenous populations, and they're looking at them, and they're seeing why they're healthy and why they're not healthy, because we can see that. And I think that's the thing is that. Social workers at some point are going to be diving into this kind of knowledge and information, and it's going to be required of us to do that kind of thing, because when we say we practice a holistic approach to social work, we truly don't. We're at a very surface level because we haven't taken an exploration deep inside of individuals. And I'm talking about Indigenous people now. We look at their history. Of land loss, the land theft that's occurred, the racism, the theft, the taking of their children, all the mortality that exists, and low life expectancy, and so on, all these things. But we haven't dug real deep into the consequences of that at the molecular level and how we need to change that, because we're not changing it. We haven't really made a lot of progress. I've taught social work for many years. I'm not doing it now as a dean, but the models that we use are just so primitive and ancient. We have to understand that, not one size fits everybody. And even within a population, there's going to be variance for some people that we have to attend to, people as a group, as a whole, but also individually at those cellular and molecular levels. So it's very important for us to think about that and how we translate that to all populations, because, when you look at the populations in the United States, for example, or North America, let's say Turtle Island, people are living longer, but they're spending the last 20, 25 years of their lives being very, very sick, barely dragging themselves to the finish line. And being on all kinds of drugs, right? My mother was like that. She lived to be 94, but she was on all kinds of She took many different kinds of pills a day because, you know, she became a statistic, I guess I'd say, of settler colonialism, of the diet and lifestyle. Her before she started living where we live now in White Shield, she lived in the villages with all our people down in where our people got flooded out, and they ate off the land. They moved a lot. They hung out a lot. They danced a lot. They sang a lot. They were together a lot, helping each other a lot. And so the big change was to take them and put them in an industrialized society. And of course, in that society, you know, we haven't fared well, but neither has anyone, right? This is why mindfulness has gotten into all these organizations, because people are suffering so much from anxiety disorders and depression and suicide, and their productivity slips. So now all these CEOs are bringing mindfulness into things like, you know, Google or Amazon, or, you know, all these big these groups are bringing it in, and so our organizations. It's like last thing I'll say. It's like a lot like the book that was called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Succeed or Fail, written by Jared Diamond. You know, we see the collapse happening all around us. This is not a sustainable life that we live, you know, in North America. We were pillaging the planet. You know, we're building pipelines. We're doing all this stuff, you know, to destroy the planet, and we're destroying ourselves in the same time. So what Jared talks about, that, you know, is how these different cultures saw that all happening, but many of them chose to ignore it. They just sort of put it off for the, you know, and said, well, maybe if we do this, you know, we can slow down climate change. And in the case of I think it was the Sumerians, they had planted so close to the ocean that the ocean, when it rose, the sea levels rose. After a while, it started killing all their wheat, and so they went to create barley, and barley was more hardy, so they lasted a little longer. But the collapse, overshoot and collapse was about to happen, as ecologists tell us. So I think that's the idea, is that, you know, it's important for all of us to go back to this kind of lifestyle and return to a place where, you know, we're not at war with the planet or one another, but we're seeking some kind of some really important relationship, you know, with one another and the planet. So,
well, thank you very much for a very wonderful presentation, spending time with us today, and your sharing all the good work that you're doing. So it's wonderful to have you with us today as we continue our work to dismantle systems of racism and promote change at CSU. We want to thank you for coming into our community via Zoom and sharing your decolonizing Indigenous scholarship work and wisdom. We want to give you a gift that you can see here on the screen. This was, and we will send it home to you. You don't have to drive down here to pick it up. A Chumash elder, Linda Aguilar, is part of the Native community here in Fort Collins. She is a horsehair basket maker and has made this basket for you. It's got a abalone kind of coin in the middle of it, so that will be on your way as a way of saying thank you. Also, I'd like to thank the school's Committee for Social Justice and Maureen Viescas, Zemzau instructor in the School of Social Work, and the Committee for Social Justice chair for organizing Dr. Yellowbird's visit, and for their ongoing commitment to achieving equity for all. And once again, thank you to Brad Sheafor and all of the supporters of the Brad Sheafor Lecture in Social Work, and also to the Department of Ethnic Studies and the CSU Native American Cultural Center for partnering with the School of Social Work on this event. So again, thank you so much for attending today, everyone who joined us, and for your thoughtful questions. This concludes today's program.
David,
have a good evening and be well.
David, can I say one thing?
No, certainly.
Well, good, because when you said I was going to give you a gift, I was like, oh boy, I sat up in my chair. I said, I bet they're going to give me, they did the land acknowledgement. I bet they're going to give me about 5 acres close to my brother Ron down there.
Well, that could be arranged, although the land prices have gone up a little bit with,
well, I was paying for it though, see?
Well, just contact us and we'll see if we can make that happen for you.
Yeah, that's that's just my funny bone gene going off. So
I get it. Yeah, I've got one myself.
thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone.
It's good to see everybody.